If you were absent from class on Thursday or Friday of the first week of school, this video will help you set up your tile lab pages in your journal, and I will also walk you through the procedure of actually completing the lab. The first thing you need to do is set up your next two journal pages, as you see here. Page 4, the title of the page is Tile Lab, and that page will just be for data analysis. Don't copy the note that's on the post-it note. The facing page, page 4A, leave a space at the top for you to fill in your own title. You're going to choose your own title for this lab. But do go ahead and write out the next few words, which is purpose, leave a space to fill that in, a prediction, again leave a space, diagram, procedure, you'll need quite a bit of space for that, and then data at the bottom of page 4A. In order to perform the lab, I have provided you with 4 irregularly shaped pieces of a floor tile. That means they're not going to all be perfect squares, perfect rectangles, perfect triangles, and so on. You will also have a ruler, an electronic scale, and graph paper that has 1/2 centimeter size boxes. So when you're finding area, 4 boxes would be equal to 1 centimeter squared. Your job is to use those materials and find the area and the mass of each small piece of tile. Now the mass is easy, you just use the scale and write down the number. In order to find the area, there's a few different ways you can do that. The most common I have listed here. So the first thing you could do would be to trace each tile onto a piece of graph paper, count the boxes on the inside, and divide that by 4, because as I said up at the top, that 4 boxes is equal to 1 centimeter squared. Now, if you use my graph paper, that will work. If you use your own graph paper, you'll have to double check and measure the size of your boxes. You could also trace each tile onto that graph paper, and then instead of counting the boxes, use the straight lines as a guide to help you divide those shapes into squares and rectangles and triangles. Those are a lot easier to find the area of because the formulas are fairly simple. You add up each regular shape that you've divided your tile into, and that would be the total area. The third most common option would be just drawing lines directly on the tiles and following the directions as above. So dividing your irregular shapes into regular ones and finding the total combined area. Now, why are we doing all this? What is the purpose of this lab? I can tell you that one full floor tile, one complete tile, is 30.5 centimeters by 30.5 centimeters. Using those numbers, you can find the area of one full tile. But that full tile is too large to weigh on our scale. The purpose of our lab is for you to find out its mass using those smaller pieces. So under purpose, and in this case you may use my words if you wish or rewrite it in your own words, but your purpose is to determine the mass in grams of one full floor tile by gathering information about its pieces. So we're looking at the small parts and trying to determine what does that tell us about the larger one. The next section of your lab is titled Prediction. Prediction is where you are thinking about what is going to happen. In some cases, we might be making a hypothesis, but in this case, it's just a prediction. What do I think is going to happen? And I want you to estimate in grams the mass of one full tile. I will tell you that our scales can go up to 600 grams, so we know that a full tile is more than that since we can't weigh the tile on our scales. Underneath prediction, you should write something like, I predict that the mass of one full tile is, and then you enter your prediction. If it's way off from the real number, that's okay. Part of the purpose of this lab is to get you used to using units like centimeters, meters, and grams. Those are things that you're not as familiar with, so if your prediction is way off at this point, that's okay. The next two parts of your lab are diagram and procedure. For the diagram, just draw out a quick sketch of your lab materials. Since we don't have a materials list, that's where you will draw out, these are the things that I've used in order to do this lab. Make sure you include a drawing of your tile pieces so that I know the shapes that you're working with. Under procedure, the first thing you have to do is to figure out how you're going to complete the lab. Once you've decided that, you will have to write out a list of your steps. So I've shown you an example here. Number 1, trace each tile piece onto a sheet of graph paper. Number 2, draw straight lines within the tracing to divide the tiles into rectangles and triangles. Number 3, use the ruler to measure each side of the shapes, etc. Write down every single thing that you do in order to complete the lab. Something to remember is that if you do this part correctly, I should be able to take your procedure list and give it to someone else, and they would be able to repeat your same experiment. A lot of times people find it easier to actually do it first, so complete the lab or the measurements, and then go back and say, okay, what did I do? And write out those steps after you're actually finished. That's okay at this point. The next two parts for your data collection and completing your lab are data analysis and then just data. Data analysis is what we have written on page 4 of our lab, and that's where you would write out any numbers, formulas, any calculations that you do separately from graph paper. If you were to trace your pieces on graph paper, I would ask you to cut them out or fold up that page of graph paper and glue them onto the page. If you're not sure how to do that without covering things up, come and see me and I can show you how to do that. Keep in mind also that you'll be adding a graph onto that page at the end of your lab. And then at the bottom of page 4A, once you have actually found the area and the mass of your small tile pieces, you'll need to make a chart of some kind that organizes your information. You may have all those numbers written in other places around your lab report, but your data chart is just one neat place to gather everything into one spot. The next thing that you'll need to do is to use a sheet of graph paper and make a graph. Our graph is going to be mass versus area. Area on your x-axis, mass on your y-axis. So you'll take the area and mass of each piece and plot that point on your graph. At this point, do not connect your dots. Sometimes when you're making a line graph, you will want to connect one dot to the other, but we're not going to do that for this particular lab. Now that you have your points plotted, you have 4 points plotted on your graph, we're going to draw what's called a best fit line. A best fit line starts down at 0, 0, and it goes about in between all of your points. So this line might not actually touch any of your 4 dots or your 4 plotted points, and that's okay. Your goal is to make it go as close to the middle of your 4 points as you can. You can see in my example here that some of the points are not actually on the line. It happens to end right at the first one, and that's okay too. But you can see that we've got a little above and a little below my best fit line. Once you have that line drawn, you're going to find the slope of your line, or your rise over run. So that's the difference in y coordinates divided by the difference in x coordinates. What you want to do here is to choose 2 spots on your line that are not your plotted points. You want to make sure that you're choosing places directly on the best fit line that you just made. So here and here. You'll notice that none of my 4 plotted points are included in that distance there. Mark your places on your graph that you're using. Mark the line. See how I've drawn a little right triangle right here. Mark that on your graph as well. And then actually write out your calculations. So for my graph, using my numbers, my rise is 45, and we use units, and our y-axis is mass, so it's 45 grams. And my run, my x-axis, which is area, is 65 centimeters squared. When I put that in my calculator and get my decimal point, my final slope equals 0.69 grams per centimeter squared. So I want you to write your calculations on your graph as well. If your slope is close to mine, that's great. If your slope is a little bit off from mine, that's okay too. We'll talk about why that might be toward the end of the lab. Now that you've found the slope, what that tells you is about how many grams are in every 1 centimeter squared of floor tile. So you know that your floor tiles weigh about 0.69 grams for every square centimeter. If you multiply that slope by the area of a full tile, and remember I told you the dimensions before, 30.5 times 30.5. If you multiply that, you get an area of 930.25 square centimeters. Multiply those two numbers together, and you'll get your calculated total mass. Write those calculations on your graph and circle your final answer. Now, some of you may have gone through some calculations previously, some proportional calculations, and figured out what you thought was the final mass. That number may look different from this number, and that's all right. It should still be pretty close. Before you move on, I want you to fold or trim or both your graph, and you're going to glue it onto your data analysis page. Remember not to glue right on top of any calculations or writing, so see me again if you need help figuring out how to glue that down into your journal. Once you've completed all of that other stuff, you're going to turn to the next blank page, and it'll be 4B. This is all part of the same thing. So page 4B is where you're going to write your summary and your sources of error, your error analysis. Now, thinking back to English class, if you were to summarize a paragraph or summarize a short story, you would have to talk about the beginning, the middle, and the end. You wouldn't just say, well, the butler did it, and just give away the ending. You would have to talk about the whole story from beginning to the end. A lab summary does exactly the same thing. You're going to explain your entire lab from start to finish. You start that off by restating your purpose. So someone should be able to read your summary and know exactly what you did to complete your lab. Remember, it's very important to also include your final answer in this summary as well. So what number did you come up with for the mass of one full tile? And finally, we're going to talk about sources of error. For your sources of error, that's where you talk about things that might have affected your result, how you can avoid them, and how you can maybe minimize them in the future. Things like, I might have done my math wrong, or entered it into my calculator wrong, or I forgot to zero out my scale. Those are not acceptable for sources of error, because those are things that you can fix right away. If you think you might have typed numbers into your calculator wrong, go back and retype them into your calculator. That's not an acceptable source of error. Something that you could put would be, the tape on my tile piece could have affected its mass. Some of you had pieces of tile on your table that had tape on them. Tape has mass, so that can affect your final answer. How you drew your best fit line would affect your final answer as well, because that would affect your slope, which affects your calculations. Those of you that used proportional equations to figure out your final mass in the beginning of the lab, you might notice if you do the same calculation with different pieces of tile, you're going to end up with different numbers. And that's because the proportions of each individual tile could be different depending on the size, the straightness of the sides, the accuracy of your measurements, and things like that. Rounding your numbers would affect your final answer as well. If you wrote your numbers out to the 10th place or 100th place or 1000th place versus rounding up to the ones place, that makes a difference in your final answer as well. So just talk about at least 2 different things that might have affected your result and what you think that might change in your answer and how you could avoid those or minimize those issues in the future. When you have finished the entire lab report, all 3 pages, you have all of your things glued down, go back to the tile lab report rubric that was handed out in class. Look at each individual section and find the My Score column on the right side of the page. You are going to grade yourself on the lab, and then it will be graded by a classmate, and it will also be graded by me. So that will give other people an opportunity to see how you did it as compared to how they might have done their own. If you have any questions, you may watch the video of Mr. Franz explaining and showing examples of each section, and you can certainly come to tutorials and ask any questions that you may have. Good luck!